And I'm extremely happy to announce to you a great panel of journalists, intellectuals dealing with this region for a very long time. Let me introduce to you as they were saying, at the extreme right to me. Caroline de Gruyter, Europe correspondent for NRC Handelsblad in Brussels. Then comes Paul Lendvai, journalist, author, Vienna, Kathrin Kahlweit, CE correspondent for Süddeutsche Zeitung, also in Vienna. Very much looking forward. Let's go in medias res. We have here the possibility to maybe think also a little bit out of the box, to see maybe more from a macro perspective, and including not only economic issues, not only because we had political science people, we had economists speaking. So let's maybe broaden the view a little bit, and I would like to start with Caroline de Gruyter. Now it's more than a year after the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. Now, given that our panel is called Rethinking Central and Eastern Europe after the invasion, now what is your take on what is the position of Central and Eastern Europe in the EU?
Thank you very much also for that kind introduction, because after having been called extreme right, it can only get better, no? From here on. Super nice to be here again. My focus is European politics, has always been European politics. So I look at Central and Eastern Europe from that angle. And what I see is that since the Russian invasion in Ukraine, Central and Eastern European countries are finally arriving. They're emancipating in the EU, and you might say they're finally arriving in the EU. The first inkling of this I got last year. I think it was 3 days after the invasion, after the war started, at the end of February, on a Sunday evening. So the war started on Thursday, right? I don't know, because Thursday is the day I have to write my column, and I had to throw it away and do a completely new one. So on the Sunday evening, we had people for dinner, just in the kitchen, friends. And they were late because they were in the council. They are diplomats. They were in the council. They came late, and they said, you know what just happened? Poland has just proposed to make Ukraine a candidate member of the EU. And my first question was, of course, did anybody support the Poles? And she said, no, but I think we're in a totally different ballgame now because this is going to change. And she was right. So that was my first inkling that something was changing in the EU. I've lived in Brussels on and off, living there and then living in Vienna and in Oslo and in Geneva, but always coming back into the bubble. And to me, the war has really totally changed the situation of Central and Eastern European countries. So that was the first example. The second example, it was just a few months later, when Slovenia just had a new prime minister, Mr. Golob. Janša lost the elections, Golob came in, and just a few weeks after that, there was a European Council meeting. So a summit, heads of state and government. Usually, when you're a new prime minister and you go to Brussels for your first council meeting, you shut up, right? You just sign everything on the dotted line, or you ask, if you really object to something, you ask somebody else who's been there for much longer. In this case, Mr. Golob, the new prime minister, talked for 15 minutes on the energy problem, or the coming energy problem. And this was not even his idea. He did so on behalf of the Benelux countries, of which my country, the Netherlands, is one. This, I can tell you, 10 years ago would never have happened. That was a second indication. And I think there are many, many more examples of this. Of course, for a new member state of the European Union, it takes years before, it's a bubble. It's not for nothing, it's a bubble. It has its own mores, it has its own rules, its own unwritten everything. You need to be extremely well connected to be effective, to be able to push something in Brussels, to be able to block something in Brussels. So it can take easily, it can take 10 years. But with a lot of Central Eastern European countries, it took almost 20, I think it was Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, who recently said, when we came in 2004, we didn't call Austria a new country anymore. We are still called new countries. She is right, but probably next year she will not be right anymore, which I think is great. I remember Central and Eastern European countries in Brussels being extremely timid, feeling weak, like we're not bringing this up because nobody listens anyway. I remember a piece that Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes wrote about the inferiority complex of countries in this region, the inferiority complex in Europe, looking up at your supposedly great examples and constantly also failing to pass the threshold, resulting for some countries even in rebellious behavior. So if you can't be like your example, you try to destroy it. And this is, according to Krastev and Holmes, what, for instance, Viktor Orban is trying to do. I remember the total blockage by the Visegrad countries, mad, furious with rage because they had been outvoted with quality majority voting about the distribution of refugees. They made everybody's lives miserable for, almost 10 years. So for a very long time after the big enlargement in 2004, the old Europe continued to do its business, sort of passing by the so-called new Europe. And the West was also, and I think I'm guilty of this myself, although I've lived here in Vienna, so I should have known a little bit better. But listening to some Poles or people from the Baltics about Russia, we all thought, you calm down a little bit. This is perhaps a little bit exaggerated. Well, it wasn't. So then came Putin. Putin was there all along, but then he really invaded Ukraine. And really everything changed, in my view. I think the best example of this, there are many examples, big and small, but the biggest of all, I think, is the position of Poland. Poland is not only a very big EU member state, it also had a big problem with the rest of the EU on the rule of law. So before the war broke out, before Russia invaded Ukraine, Poland was totally in the corner. It had boxed itself totally in a corner. Many foreign ministers from other member states did not visit Poland anymore. They were not involved in all kinds of talks on foreign policy. Foreign policy is totally intergovernmental in Europe. There is no European foreign policy. So you involve, usually, some of the biggest member states. Poland would have qualified, and they were on their way. But because of the rule of law issue, nobody wanted to have Poland around. In the think tank ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations, in 2020, Poland, so they asked all the EU capitals, all 27 capitals, like which country is performing the best, which one is boxing below its weight. Poland was called the second most disappointing member state in the European Union. Yeah. And now, suddenly, since the end of February 2022, Poland is a frontline state. Everybody and everything, refugees, VIPs, weapons, food, humanitarian aid goes to Ukraine and from Ukraine via Poland. And all of a sudden, ministers are visiting Poland again. It is a very, very crucial place in the war effort. And so, all of a sudden, you know, it was just 3 days after the war that the Polish ambassador suggested to offer Ukraine candidate status in the EU. And they've been going at it ever since. I already now hear other diplomats complaining that Poland, you know, they used to say this about the Netherlands. They have 5 minutes, but they talk for 25 and try to teach everybody a lesson. This role is now for Poland. Yeah. So I hear the first complaints, and even they have not managed, but they have tried for a while to use their new status in Europe to also get out of their rule of law corner a little bit by making compromises. I mean, by far not enough. So now they're fed up and they're starting again. But I think the movement in itself, the fact that they tried, was rather telling and interesting. What else? What you see is also that maybe I should qualify this a little bit. So Central and Eastern Europe is arriving in Brussels, I said. But this is also happening to the north of Europe. The north of Europe, except Finland, which has a long border with Russia. Norway is not even a member of the EU. This may change in the future. Denmark and Sweden were just there for the market. You know, for the rest, they didn't really have to do have to do a lot with the EU. This is changing. They are participating in everything now. They are discussing becoming members of the banking union as well. So there's a movement. Europe is not just for the market any longer, to do business, but it provides us with security, which the Finns could have told them before. Because if you ask the Finn, why did you join the euro, while other Nordic countries did not, they didn't talk about exchange rates or something like that. No. They talked about security. Every layer of European cooperation for the Finns, bordering Russia, is an extra layer of security. Voilà. And the South, which has now recovered from the euro crisis, more or less, and moreover didn't have any energy crisis, is also, you know, becoming more self-assured and more active in Europe, and vocal as well. What I want to mention as well is that Central and Eastern Europe, there is more in Western media about it. We have my Dutch newspaper now has 2 correspondents in Central and Eastern Europe, and sometimes we send all kinds of freelancers or people from Amsterdam as well, more than before. So there's more attention in the media. On a private note, I'm a member of a book club in Brussels. I became a member when I first arrived in 1999, and we always read books, novels, so we all work our butts off normally, so we only do fiction, that's the deal. We had trouble for a long time finding, so we wanted to find somebody from the new countries, which was, you know, around 2003 or 4, I guess. And, you know, none of us really knew them. Now we have 2. So also in a social sense, which is very important because a lot of things have to do with personal relationships and your networks in Brussels, which is also a sign that people, the people are arriving in Brussels as well. Let me close with a message of, I think he was a Romanian philosopher, Andrei Plezu. I see people nodding, I did that well. He was once asked if you had one message for Europeans, what would it be? And he said, relax.
Is that gespritzte?
Gespritzte, weiße gespritzte. We'll have that later. He said, relax, you know. Yes, we fight all the time in Europe, and I could go on about this forever, but I won't now. Yes, we always disagree, because in the EU, all member states are listened to, and everybody can pond their eggs in Brussels, and everybody will find something of his own wishes and demands back into whatever the decision, a European decision is in the end. So yes, we struggle all the time. But in the end, we will be fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our takeaway is that we are witnesses to the emancipation of Central and Eastern Europe. The soon not to be anymore called new member states are finally arriving in the EU. Now, given the course of this seminar, this is very an optimistic take of what is happening in the region. So we have to do something about it, Paul Lendvai, because I mean we also have to see that there is a string of countries in Central Europe with actually quite a lot of understanding for Russia and a number of other problems. So how comes?
I am absolutely delighted that someone is sitting next to me from a fantastic country, the Netherlands, and has such an optimistic view of Central and Eastern Europe. I'm afraid that I can't share it. It's not because of age. I would like to be very optimistic. My main subject, whenever I think about this area, when I talk to my wife or friends, that I am ashamed. Ashamed why I had not really assessed the Ukraine correctly. I belong to those who hadn't realized what a fantastic thing happened. Maidan, all these things in the Ukraine, the kind of forming a nation with all the problems, with all the corrupt figures. And when I see all this, what's happened, then I feel ashamed that we hadn't really paid enough attention to the Ukraine. It gave me also optimism, reason for optimism, that an actor, on top of it mainly a comic actor, became a historical personality. And you see, Viktor Orban made a remark, he likes to make remarks about other people, not when it's about him, and he made a remark about Zelensky that yes, he studied law and then became an actor. I studied law and completed it and became a politician. He completed it too, and he worked, and he built up a very successful company, in contrast to Viktor, who is 60 today or yesterday, who never worked in his life. He got all the money from George Soros, and I even saw the college where he was, Pembroke College in Oxford. Anyhow, so for me the main point is many of us should be ashamed how we neglected to see the position of the Ukraine. Now, what you said about these countries, quoting the famous invention of very respected colleague of ours, Ivan Krastev, which goes back to the last century, to a French sociologist, about the copying of the systems and so on, but he did very cleverly, very well. He always has a new thing. And unfortunately, if I look at these countries, which I have been studying and following for many years, I don't know where did Bulgaria arrive, for instance. With 5 elections in 2 years, who is less corrupt, who is more corrupt, will now be this fantastic woman who was very nicely described by Catherin in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, really make a difference in Bulgaria. When I look at Slovakia, that someone who was involved in one of the most revolting assassination in the background, of course, of a investigating journalist in Bratislava, namely Robert Fico. I had the honor of giving him my biography of Orban. In those years, he was still more skeptical and not a great friend. And it looks that in Slovakia, he might become, at the end of this year, the strongest, he will lead the strongest party and form a new government. And what you said about Slovenia, that's, I agree, because it's a fantastic thing that Janez Janša lost this election. He is still around, and I met most of the prime ministers who, between his triumphs, were in power. Very nice man and very good man. And I don't know Mr. Golov, but if he made a good impression on you, that's very good. I am afraid, basically, that the European Union hasn't really changed. If you look at the situation with regard to Hungary or to Poland, a few words about Poland. Poland is in a fantastic situation today. On the one hand, the front state with the Ukraine, forgetting everything what's happened in 1944, the mutual killings, etc., what they do is absolutely fantastic. That's one side of the story. The other side of the story, that they also wanted to copy, not a French sociologist, but unfortunately Viktor Orban. And they tried to dismantle the legal system, etc. And at this moment, they are setting up a commission, almost on the pattern of the McCarthy things in the United States, to investigate the influence of communism, only to trying to destroy the reputation of Tusk, who was a fantastic figure. So on the one hand, they play a very serious, important role. On the other hand, they would like to stay in power, and for that, they are willing to do things which are not necessarily in accord with the values of the European Union. Finally, I don't want to go more details, a few words about Hungary. Orban is, as my wife is not here, I can say, the ablest and most dangerous politician in modern Hungarian history. And nobody has become so well known as he is. I brought here just a collection of news items of 1 week, and it gives you an impression of what's happening. Orban on the Ukraine, there is no chance to win the war. Where did he say that? He was at the Qatar Economic Forum talking to the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, a British journalist, who is obviously highly intelligent, but hasn't really done his homework. He hasn't asked one single question about what was happening during the 13 years Viktor Orban was running this country in Hungary itself. So that I want to say, there he talked about the Ukraine. Number 2, he said, yes, they blocked 500 million euro money for the armaments for the Ukraine because the Ukraine put one of the Hungarian banks, along with Austrian banks, on the blacklist. Third thing, he was very much in favor of Trump, hoped that Trump and the Republicans will win. Fourth, the most incredible argument, he was asked, why is Hungary holding up Sweden's entry into NATO? You know, Hungary held up even the Finnish entry, although Hungarians and Finns supposed to be very close to each other, or there are more Turkish words in Hungarian than Finnish, but it's a fact. And in the end, they sent a delegation to Sweden, Finland and Sweden, and the deputy chairman of the Hungarian parliament was there, and he was asked, why are you here? What have we done to you? And he said he doesn't really know. They didn't really know why they went there. They had obviously a good sign in Sweden. Everybody has a good time in Sweden when he was there. And they still, and when Orban was asked, he said, oh, they write such nasty things about us. They are so unfriendly. So if you are unfriendly, then the whole German-French friendship could break up if Macron would read all the editorials in the Süddeutsche. So, I mean, that's also a statement. So, and it's unbelievable. And then comes the most important thing. Freedom House describes autocratization, and even lower down is Hungary. And now there is the debate in the European Parliament whether in 24 Hungary and then Poland should be the president.
Yeah, fascinating.
And if you think of it, what's happened until now, in the 13 years since this revolution happened in the boothing cages in Hungary, you see that there were some resolutions by the European Parliament, but basically the European Commission now started to do things. And so I think that it's understandable if the Hungarians agree with Guy, how do you pronounce the name of the former Belgian Prime Minister, Verhofstadt, who said Hungary wouldn't be admitted today to the European Union. So these are somehow, the strength is the hypocrisy of the European Union. And that's why I am less optimistic and less enthusiastic about the Central Europeans finding their way, in the way when the Spanish secretary or foreign minister of the EU said, now we have already one conflict and Kosovo would be too much. It's an incredible statement. They haven't done anything. Most of them don't know anything about Kosovo. Only when there are shooting or some problems, they realize what's happened. And 5 of the EU countries don't even recognize yet Kosovo. Anyhow, I think that the Russian war against the Ukraine woke up Western Europe and certainly played a major role in Poland, gave a push to the Baltic countries, who are in a very, very dangerous situation, and they are very brave. But I don't think that Central and Eastern Europe has any reason to be very satisfied how they act and how they are being received in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the takeaway is that we have to be ashamed of clearly having underestimated Ukraine, but the EU has not changed, and neither has Hungary, apparently. Now, Kathrin Kahlweit, interesting, there is also a number of countries outside the Union that are actually reshaping the region, and they are as different as Moldova or the United Kingdom. How comes?
Well, We have journalists up here on stage. Everybody keeps telling anecdotes, which is maybe a bit difficult. I've been traveling the region for, I think, 30 years all in all, and I dare to say one thing, I've never underestimated Ukraine. We have a very famous anti-corruption fighter in the room, and corruption is the endemic problem of Ukraine, but there always was a very, very strong civil society that had been educated in the West, that had been that had learned how to fight for themselves, and this civil society did not develop in 2013-14 on Maidan, but it had been there long before. And while the West decided that Ukraine was once again, after some hopes had risen and collapsed, was once again a failed state, it turned out to not be. And I'm on the side of the optimist. I'm sorry to say. I would exclude Hungary, but I'm on the side of the optimist. And Ukraine shows a lot of things that give reason for optimism, and there's comparisons that can be made. Ukraine shows that you can fight against an aggressor, you can organize a society under pressure, and you can move towards Europe, not by wanting, but also by demanding, because it's a question of mutual strength. And that question of mutual strength, I believe, is true for Moldova, which has been underestimated terribly. Moldova is a country, a very poor country of bucolic beauty. Nobody ever knew where it is until the war broke out, which is true, I think, for Bulgaria, Romania, and many other countries too, that the Western European countries never had on their list. They knew they were expensive, they knew they were corrupt, they knew they do not belong to the European Union, but okay, we have to deal with that once we made the mistake of accept them, then now we have to deal with the problem that they're there. Moldova is, my thesis, it's a small Ukraine. It's terribly corrupt. After 10 years in Ukraine, I don't understand a thing about how that economy works and how those oligarchs still can survive, which is true for Moldova too. It's a corrupt society, it's a very poor society, it has a very defunct judicial system, just like unfortunately Ukraine still has, although there are reforms, and they have a president who looks very cute and very nice and much younger than she is, and she has balls of steel. She has been surviving in a very difficult society and surrounding with lots of Russian influence and Russian propaganda for years now. She's been prime minister, she's been gone, she's come back, she's been gone, she's come back, now she's president for a while. And she survives in a surrounding where there is military pressure, there's massive Russian propaganda, and there is no money. And I would dispute your thesis that the Eastern European countries come to Brussels. Brussels is coming to them because it needs them. It needs them. Moldova is getting millions and millions from Brussels at the moment as a EU candidacy status. I think all in all, if you add it up, it's 1 billion. It's been 1 billion for the last year. Otherwise, I wouldn't have survived, just as Ukraine wouldn't have survived if that money hadn't come. But why does that happen? Why do 50 leaders travel to a summit in Moldova tomorrow, for the European Partnership Summit? Because Moldova matters, just like Bulgaria matters. Corrupt, terrible state, no new government. Maria Gabriel probably will not be the new prime minister, nothing works. But they're being needed. Romania is being needed. I was in Romania last week. I was in Moldova 4 weeks ago. They're opening up their doors. They're showing off their military. They show off their air bases. They start collecting weapons. They get money for defense. And they know why they're needed because they're the ones defending us on that border, just like Moldova does. Moldova is neutral. Moldova is not a member of NATO. But there's discussions about, the support on the cyber war front. There's discussions about air defense systems being delivered. There's discussions about an enhancement of trade, lowering customs. There is, and that is another thing that makes me optimistic, a front that has been exaggerated in the West, that's my sincere conviction, which is the pro-Russian front in these countries. When we look at Romania, when we look at Bulgaria, when we look at Moldova, when we look at, Hungary is a different question. We have all those parties that are officially pro-Russian. What they are is they're hungry and they're poor and they pay voters. And what they do is they thrive on Putin's messengers, But they can't get through that much anymore. There's anti-propaganda laws. There's hybrid war, which is being, a fight against hybrid war, which is stronger. Again, with money from the European Union and with money from NATO. There is developments, like, for example, the socialists in many of those countries, actually pro-Russian, they don't really have much of an influence anymore. They're losing influence, even though there has been a discussion about them, taking over, or the Russian parties getting into power. Where did they? So far, they haven't. And that is true for Moldova too. Moldova has a very strong pro-Russian sentiment. About half the population speaks Russian, the other speaks Romanian, which used to be called Moldovan, which is not a language. And they have the Gagauzins just won election. The Shor party in Gagauzia just won elections, pro-Russian officially. But in fact, it's a poor, stupid oligarch, rich, who fled to Israel, paying voters to pay for his party. That is as much pro-Russian as any paid vote that you have to deal with, but that really does not threaten the government. It does not threaten the government. And when you talk to the government advisors and politicians in Moldova, they say, actually this helps us too. This helps us because the West looks at the threats that we're under. It looks at, at the fear that Russian influence will grow, helps us because more money is coming in, more weapons are coming in, more attention is coming in. And we can cope with that. And they do cope with that. And Maia Sandu is still in power. The Romanians are dealing with a difficult situation. They're sending weapons to Ukraine. And they have a lot of support from the Americans. In the end, something will have happened that Putin will turn around in his grave a lot of times about. Because, again, looking at Moldova, they were completely dependent on Russian gas. And half of their export was going to Russia, and much money was coming in from Russia because of people working in Russia, sending back their money home. Now, Moldovans don't work in Russia anymore, most of them. So the money is coming, more people are going to the West, money is coming from the West, private money too. What happened to the dependency on gas? The Russians, stupid as they were, reduced gas delivery by 30% a year ago, and they raised prices. So Moldova couldn't pay the gas anymore, and they didn't have enough. And they're dependent on electricity in Transnistria, which is, again, a pro-Russian separatist state within Moldova, but exaggerated, the threat that's coming from there too. And Transnistria is producing the electricity for all of Moldova. What did they do? They started to deal, because they didn't have enough for all of them, and they didn't want to lose the Transnistrians to the Russian influence. So they said, okay, you get all the gas that we have left, which is 70%. We transfer it all to Transnistria. We make a deal with those separatists. You send us as much energy as we need. And the deal is up until today, and they talk more today than they used to before that war. And then again, they started to buy gas from Azerbaijan, from Romania. The Ukrainians started to deliver gas again. So now, Moldova is less energy dependent on Russia than it used to be before the war, just like in many other countries do, as we obviously know. So the Zeitenwende is not only a question of the Germans giving tanks to Ukraine. The Zeitenwende is something that Putin produced. It's a new way of thinking, a new way of independence, a new pride, and the understanding that the necessity goes both ways. And we're dependent on Central Eastern Europe, and the Central Eastern Europeans are dependent on us. And they are growing more independent. That is, I think, the best thing about it. And Ukraine does too. And Ukraine now is not as naively pro-Western European anymore as it used to be. On Maidan, everybody was crying as long as everybody was waving the blue flags with the golden stars. No, it's not that anymore. When you go to Ukraine today, people are much more aware of the problems of the hypocrisy, and of the lies, and of the double standards. But they know that they can make it alone, and that's true for Moldova, and that's true for many Eastern countries that are growing stronger as long as this war lasts. And I'm going to skip Britain now, because that's going to lead me into another track. They just made a mistake, and they try to make it good. That's about it.
Thank you very much. So we found out that Ukraine can at the same time fight an aggressor and come closer to the Union. Also, Moldova has been underestimated despite huge problems that are clearly there, and that there is a mutual dependence between countries in the wider region and the European Union. I would like to underline your observations on Moldova. I've been recently to Chisinau, and we have been meeting the people who are organizing the summit of the European political community. I think it's this weekend.
It's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow. And in the office of the president, in the foreign ministry, and I have to say these were fantastic, great people, very strong women, by the way, who actually had great jobs in Brussels, were educated in the West, and nevertheless came back to their country, although they don't earn anything there really, and have to work basically day and night, because their problem is basically they don't have any capacities. They have a handful of people, and I think they are doing really a great job under very difficult conditions, and showed to be really true Europeans. Now I have a number of questions, but I will hold back, and I'm looking at the tired but nevertheless still active participants of this seminar and invite you to have your questions and comments and side presentations. If not, I will take away your time. And here we have the first icebreaker.
Yeah, my name is Ernst Hillebrand. I'm working for the German Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Budapest. And well, I'm a bit irritated by what I was hearing. It was a typical show of self-complacency of the European left liberal bubble establishment, telling us how these Eastern Europeans got many things wrong, but somehow, because of geopolitical reasons, we have to take them more serious right now. But I mean, if I look with hindsight, I think that what we have seen is that many positions the political elites of these countries have been holding for a certain period of time have been proven to be a bit more realistic than the positions we had as the left liberal establishment of Western Europe. I mean, if you look at the role of NATO on the United States as a security provider of last resort, we are far away from this discussion about European autonomy or sovereignty and defense issues. The Eastern Europeans were right. Without the United States, there is no security in Europe. When we look at migration policy, look here in Austria how your political line of this country, of your government has changed. If you compare to 2015-16, the position of the European Union today is much closer to the position of the Central Eastern European countries of that time than of the mood of 2015. If you look at energy policy, the consensus, at least in Berlin, was that nuclear energy is bad, we have to get out, that's yesterday technology. Eastern Europeans did insist on the strategic role of nuclear energy, for example, to provide energy security. Look at the economic dynamics. I mean, the Central Eastern Europe is the most economically dynamic part of Europe. Western Europe is the most undynamic part of the world economy. So something they got wrong, and we did not get quite right. So I think part of the shifting importance of Central Eastern Europe has not only to do with geopolitics, that's clear. I mean, the Ukraine war has its consequences, but it is also a consequence of the fact that in some political areas, the political elites of these countries had perhaps a bit more realistic position than we had. Defense spending, for example. Yeah, but you didn't mention it. You're nodding, but nobody mentioned it when we discuss about this area. And that's a bit irritating. The error is always on their side and never on ours. And I think if you look at the dynamics of the last decades, you see that in some respect they were perhaps a bit more realistic than we were.
Good that you raised a provocative so that we can still...
I'm a little bit puzzled by your question, frankly, because nobody said that they were moving towards us and we were so right. Us left-wing liberals. I mean, that's for your own credit. I do think, however, that we are moving all closer to the center, which is something different. And we are finding common issues. I mean, there were some, the country I know best is very transatlantic, very pro-NATO. So they're finding allies in Central and Eastern Europe right now. I think the migration and border question is another great example of this. Europe used to be divided between the cosmopolitans who wanted to keep everything open, and we had then the nationalists. It was a strange kind of polarized discussion. The nationalists wanted to erect borders and walls and all that. I think that the gap between the two has narrowed. Also because we had Brexit, we had a pandemic. The first time Europe, and I'm saying Europe and not EU because I lived in Norway and I've also lived in Switzerland, and they are part of this, part of all of this, although they're not members of the EU. We all closed the external border for the first time ever. Nobody even noticed, you know. It was the pandemic. We have had terrorist attacks. Now we have Putin. Suddenly, the former EU president, Herman Van Rompuy, former prime minister of Belgium, he quoted another French philosopher, whose name I forgot now, but it doesn't matter. And he says, Europe is changing from a space to a place. We were a space after the wall came down. Walls were, you know, there were no iron curtains anymore, no walls. Everybody started to roam around and travel. We were talking about enlargement, exploring diversities and freedoms. Now, people have stopped roaming. It's been enough, you know. It makes us vulnerable. And where does this end? Can Turkey become a member? People started already in the 1990s, also in Western Europe. I don't believe in this caricature of East versus West. People started asking questions. Can Turkey be a member? And what does this do to the EU, to Europe? Politicians never answered. Now Putin has answered. You know, even the cosmopolitans finally understand that we need border protection. We need to, not to stop migration, we need to manage it. We bloody need, I wanted to book a restaurant 2 days ago in Vienna, and the guy said, yeah, we're closed because we don't have the personnel. So we're only open 3 nights a week. I mean, this is the reality also in Belgium, where I live now, in the Netherlands, in Norway, everywhere. So we need to manage migration better. That means we need borders too. So I don't think it is an either-or story. Moreover, Central European countries, including Poland, are taking in millions of refugees or displaced persons from Ukraine. This does something to their collective experience of a question that we have been grappling with in the West for many, many decades, integration. So finally, even there, we are moving a little bit closer to one another. That means that we are moving to each other, and it's not one part moving to the other. We are having more shared policies. This is the reality that I see in Brussels. Thank you.
I have a much shorter answer because I cannot see the contradiction either. Because the fact that the Western liberals were wrong is self-evident because Russia invaded Ukraine. And that answers all the questions and shows all the mistakes in thinking that Western liberals made. And of course, the Central Eastern Europeans were right, and that's why we're learning, and that's why Brussels is moving east. That's what I was trying to say, because of that mistake in thinking.
Okay, who else wants to give it a chance? If not, I would have actually a question. I mean, on the one hand, we see how important Poland has developed in terms of European foreign policy and so on. But one of the projects that Poland has had before the full-scale invasion, the Three Seas initiative, somehow ended nowhere, one has the feeling. While in theory it would make a lot of sense today to foster these north-south string of countries from the Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea and the Adriatic Sea, with all the issues of maybe connecting wind power in the Baltic Sea with solar power in the south and so on, and then constructing a lot of green infrastructure. But somehow this initiative ended nowhere. There is no money, there are no big projects. What happened?
Well, I didn't follow in detail this project, but I have a feeling that in that sense the Russian aggression has changed everything. And I think that it had perhaps, after the Ukraine, the strongest impact in Poland. And I think that it overshadows everything. And I think personally that Poland will play a major role because of the US connection. The estimates vary between 6 or 8 million Americans of Polish origin. But I don't think that these sort of major transnational projects really attract anymore the political elites. I think the epidemic, the inflation, the energy crisis, everything made politics much more down to earth. And it is actually fantastic that countries like Poland and also Slovakia, for instance, and the Czech Republic, what they did for the Ukraine, in actually even pushing the German government with the aeroplanes and the major armaments. So I think that the entire East Central European situation has changed, and the great question will be, will the European Union go on about the enlargement in the old ways, or will the people invent new forms and methods? For instance, Austria was member of the EFTA before joining the European Union. Clearly, for the so-called West Balkan, I can't stand this expression, they are Balkan countries, they need the markets and the access to the markets. And I think personally that there is also a time to, it's not your question, but to make a clean break with this hypocritical talking about the enlargement without concrete things. Macron will deliver a major speech probably today or tomorrow. Is his child, his 42 presidents or prime ministers will sit there. But I can't forget his interview in The Economist, when what he said about the NATO, what he said about Poland, what he said about Hungary. I mean, in the nitty-gritty of the daily politics, he has a totally different approach from the great transnational ideas and theories, which are all absolutely wonderful, and we shall weep when another lady will be the French president. But I don't see the concrete steps, and that's why I think fewer grand designs and more steps to improve the situation in time. Because this happened also now, for instance, in Kosovo, that not was timely the intervention of the European Union and of the US, both with regard to the Kosovo Albanians and to Serbia. And one mustn't forget the role of Russia in this area. That's also very important. And of course, China too is there. Anyhow, it was a long answer not to your question. But
Thank you anyway. Maybe, Carolina, you can actually answer.
You know, what is interesting about this 3Cs initiative, there are many, many of these kinds of initiatives nowadays in Europe. And this all started because of Brexit, because before Brexit you had France and Germany, which are, you know, the center of everything still, because they always disagree about everything. And you had the UK. So 3 big countries that made it very difficult for all the others, smaller ones, especially for a small one like Austria, to have influence. Then the British left in 2016, and the day afterwards, politics changed in the European Union. What you saw is that France and Germany relatively became a bit heavier because the 3rd big one had left. And so the smaller ones suddenly saw that they had to team up and, you know, try to bind the hands of the French and the Germans on their backs to block them. And this is when you have now, well, I think the Dutch, for instance, who were like orphaned after Brexit, they started this Hanseatic League. It completely failed in the end. Like, you know, keep the budget small and so on. You have an Atlantic group, which is more, which gets together, you know, all the way from Sweden, Ireland, all the way down to Portugal. So on the climate, for instance, and also on transatlantic relations. You had the South, which became much more vocal. There are many, many, many of these kinds of initiatives, too many to discuss. Some fail, some are even, you know, bypassed by more successful initiatives. It's very fascinating. Every country now, they have a list of priorities, which before they never had, and they have to look ahead and see what is on the table in Brussels, and they have to choose issues like this we want to push and this we want to block, and all the other subjects we keep to, you know, as small coins in a way. So the Dutch Prime Minister went to Kurz, Sebastian Kurz, saying, let's fight together. We can't do it with the UK anymore. Let's gang up and keep the budget as small as we can. So, and this guy had never been to Vienna before. And then Kurz, of course, asked something back on the field of migration, as usual. So, you know, there's a lot of wheeling and dealing going on and alliances formation. And this is just one of them.
Well, Kurz disappeared. Rutte is still there.
Rutte is still,
Yeah.
well.
It's a good thing. Yeah. I think that is very important what you said about the new things about the United Kingdom, because in the case of the Ukrainian issue, the Russian war, the British behaved fantastic.
Exactly.
And it's incredible, despite the changes in Downing Street 10, what they have done for the Ukraine, it's fantastic. And that shows what a loss the United Kingdom is in, but luckily they remained in NATO.
Well, it also shows that they wanted to become a new big imperial power after Brexit. That kind of failed. Boris Johnson had always promised that, but the Russian war against Ukraine was their chance to reappear on the European stage and show what they can do, where they stand, and as I said, make up for the self-inflicted problems that they caused. I wanted to add one thing to you, which we haven't mentioned so far. You said you wanted to do that. Now I'm doing it. Interesting is the decay of the Visegrad countries, which is one of the groups that always seemed to be so powerful in the East. You know, they were connected by a common cause, fighting against Brussels. You know, and now even that is like falling apart because Orban is playing his own game, and the Poles don't agree with the Hungarian position to the war, and the connectivities that used to be relevant are fading and new coalitions are building. I don't know what that leads to, but the European Union in 10 years will look completely different from the one it does, the way it looks today.
Very good.
Thank you very much. This is a confirmation of the iron rule of any discussion on Europe recently, that in the end we will discuss Brexit. I won't even try to summarize this discussion now. I would like to thank you very much for being here with us for such a long time. We will have now the possibility to continue our discussions, maybe on Brexit, maybe on something else, and slowly, if you want, walk over to the Orangerie, where we can have a few drinks, and in half an hour or so we will also have some dinner. And again, I would like to invite you to also join us tomorrow, starting from 10, going all the way to the evening, where we will actually have a small concert, and you are very much welcome to also join us there. And now I wish you a very nice evening on this beautiful day in Vienna. Thank you.